We're teaching the Word of God to inspire and motivate. We're encouraging you to inquire and investigate as you seek after hope and salvation. We're using the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, to cut through all pretense, prejudice, and preconceived ideas until we're left with nothing but the pure will of God. I'm your host, Chris Peltz, and this is Sowers with Swords. Protesting, looting, there are all kinds of stores being burned down to the ground. You've got shopping malls being burned, Walmarts and Targets being looted. All across our country, things are taking place, and a lot of Christians are wondering, what is our response to a lot of this? You've got government overreach of power. You've got abusive police officers. You've got folks that are trying to incite violence, and people that are trying to bring up issues underlying other problems. And a lot of Christians are sitting back thinking, well, what can we do? What or how should our response be in the midst of all of this turmoil that it seems as though our country is going through? And we're going to talk about that today. My name is Chris Peltz, and joining me, as he does every Tuesday, is Richard Dotson up in Kearney, Missouri. Hey, Rich, how's it going?
Very well. How you doing, Chris?
Yeah, man, doing well. Folks can find out more about Richard up in Kearney at kearneychurch.com. Just make sure as you search Kearney Church of Christ, as far as Facebook and other means is concerned, you make sure it's in Missouri and not in Nebraska. But yep, kearneychurch.com is where you can find him. Richard, in this day and age, we've already been dealing with a pandemic. We've been dealing with quarantine and self-isolation and social distancing, which really has been thrown out the window because of all of the protests and the rioting and things that have taken place. And while a lot of people are bringing up race, and race is something that we certainly should talk about a little bit, probably more in depth on another program. But when it comes to the gathering together and the protest, there are some Christians are a little confused. Can we? Should we? Is this something that we can partake in? Should partake in? I think it's pretty obvious: the rioting, the looting, the burning. I mean, you've got police cars that are being vandalized, turned over, torched, rocks being thrown and at people. There are couples that are being beaten, as they walk nearby. That they're being attacked. Store owners trying to protect their businesses are being attacked, and losing everything. And really, people are in the process of burning down their own communities and own cities. Or they've had people bust in that have come in from out of state and are engaged in burning down their cities and causing more problems than trying to help with a solution by all means. But the question that I think, and that we need to be answering, as far as particularly on this program, is the Christian's response to all of this. And there are a few things I think that are pretty obvious that have some, at least surface teaching. Romans 13 we'll look at, Matthew 22 we'll look at, but probably not spend as much time as people think on that, because those are some general teachings that have some qualifications or qualifiers that we'll need to talk about as well. But let's begin, unless you have some opening remarks you want to make, let's go to Romans 13.
Okay.
So in Romans 13, Paul in the book of Romans is going to talk about our responsibility to obey the government. That the government is set in place for a reason, to do certain things, and we need to not only allow the government to do those things, but promote that as well. One thing the government does is to punish the evildoer and to protect those, or at least they're supposed to protect those that are living right, that are following and obeying the law. I mean, that's the intent of government. And when government puts laws in place, we have a responsibility to obey those laws. That's something that really should be common sense for most people. But certainly as a Christian, that's a responsibility we have. We are to obey the laws of the land.
Oh, absolutely, we are. Um, you can go to Matthew 22, verse 21. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. That's what Jesus was saying in response to paying our taxes. He didn't say he didn't specify if they're high taxes. He didn't specify if they were fair taxes. He just said to pay your taxes, which is another way of saying obey the laws of the land. Um, you mentioned First Peter 2:13 and 14 when it commands us to be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor or supreme, or as to governors, as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. Um, yes, we are to abide by the laws of the land as long as they do not conflict with God's laws.
And that's the qualifier that I was talking about earlier, right? As you pointed out, as long as they do not violate or go against or contradict the word of God. Peter made that clear in Acts 5:29, Acts 4 verse 12, and a few other places we can read that that we ought to obey God rather than man as far as that's concerned. But when laws are put in place, as long as we can still do the will of God, then we are to obey those laws. We can look at certain liberties that we have that when it comes to driving, when it comes to speed limits. One example I've often used is in Kentucky, in Louisville. When I lived and preached there, there was a law in the books that you could not ride a horse in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. Well, obviously, it was acceptable to, in God's word, to ride a horse to go and spread the gospel. However, the law of the land said I couldn't ride a horse downtown to do that. Well, I couldn't say, well, I can spread the word. I'm supposed to spread the word, and that's how I want to do it, so that's how I'm going to do it. No, I need to obey the laws of the land and find another way, another means of getting down there. So, that's what we're talking about. Restricting riding of horses or speed limits and things of that nature does not keep us from spreading the gospel. There are other ways we can go about, other expediencies that we can go about and get that done to accomplish the will of God in that respect. But then there are other requirements, and right now one of the battles that seem to be taking place is, when they were ordering churches not to assemble, that not to assemble at all. When a lot of that seemed to be a little bit contradictory in other orders that were being given in other places that were able to have assemblies, and now, especially with the riots, with the protests that are taking place, all that seems to be thrown out the window anyway. But we are to gather together to worship God on the first day of the week, and so that's something that we are to do, and we find a means to get that done, regardless of what the government may or may not say. They don't have any pull when it comes to God and His Word in that respect. But when laws are given, and one law that we have is the law that allows us, and even in the Constitution, to assemble, not just for religious purposes. And so these protests are certainly legal. There are legal ways to go about in protesting. And several Christians do protest things such as abortion, the murdering of innocent children that takes place in this country. So there are those that will go out and in protest to things like that. And so there are things that Christians certainly are involved in that would include protest, even against things that the government is doing and saying is fine, and so there are protests against some of the government overreach that Christians can be involved in, and it's perfectly legal. I mean, our system is set up to where we can, without breaking the law, do those types of things to get our voice heard, not only through voting, but also, through other means, as long as it's peaceful. And that's one of the key things that I think has been lost in what's taking place over the past few days.
Chris, yeah, not all things. I mean, all things can be lawful, but is it expedient? Um, I'm not against someone doing what you're talking about, having a peaceful protest. I'm not against that. Right now, the law of the land says, there's a law about gatherings over 50, and then maintaining separation. I assume that's still in. We've been battling that with churches, so I assume that's still in force. I'm not sure if it is or not, but um, we have to be wise. And when you are protesting as a Christian, you are putting yourself in a dangerous predicament in this country because there are other groups at play that will try to do things to exacerbate, if I'm saying that right, exacerbate the situation. And so we got to be very careful about these peaceful protests because you may desire it for it to be a peaceful protest, but some other people may want it to be even more.
Yeah, that's right. And we see that taking place now because even many of the protesters and families of those who've been directly affected, that is at the root and the heart of many of these protests, have come out and said, "Listen, stop all of this violence and the looting and the destruction of the cities and the vandalism that is taking place, because that's not what this is about." And so there have been those that have infiltrated. There have been those that have come in and have caused these things to go astray. But and that is a danger, regardless of the situation. And Christians need to be aware of that. But let's get to kind of what sparked a lot of this taking place, and setting aside racism for just a minute, because racism is there, it's out there. We to deny that is ignorance. But there was a brutality. There was a police officer who allegedly has done something beyond reasonable force. And that happens. There are police officers across this country, for since this country's been in existence, who have abused power for one reason or another. They have done things that have been wrong. They have broken the law. They have murdered. They have beaten. That has happened. There's no denying that. It's been a few, not the whole, but it has happened. And there is in Scripture a very good response, I think. Just as Paul says to follow his example, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, to be imitators of him as he is of Christ. In every aspect, we can look at Paul's life and we can see things that we can emulate, things that we can learn from certain things that he did in the situations he found himself in, because we know that he was beaten. We know that he was stoned, that he was left for dead and imprisoned, jailed, all of these things that Paul went through. And he used the government even in the midst of fighting against the government. When he was first one of the times he was arrested and he appealed to Caesar, and so now he's going to take this journey to Rome. It may not have been necessary for that to take place, but he took advantage of the system that was there to get his point across and to preach the gospel and to maintain his innocence. But let's go to Acts chapter 16, because here is Paul in Philippi, and here he is, not after the conversion of Lydia and her household. And he had cast out this demon from this little girl who was going about various things. But what Paul had done, Paul and Silas Here he is preaching and teaching the gospel of Christ. And there are folks who are upset with Paul and Silas. And so in verse 22 and 23, and Richard, I'll just go ahead and have you read to begin with here in verse 22 and 23 of Acts chapter 16 to kind of set this up.
The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely.
So here's an occasion where Paul and Silas were beaten, um, and and unnecessarily. First of all right, there was false accusations that were made against them, and now they're taken and they're being beaten, and now they're thrown in prison. In fact, not only are they thrown in prison, but because of the orders of the magistrate. All right, so here's the local government telling the jailer, the in essence the police officer, take him, put him in jail. And so he took him to the innermost parts of the prison where they put him in shackles. Now, here we often go and we talk about how Paul and Silas were singing songs of praise. There was the earthquake that took place that shook the doors open, the chains were loosened, and the jailer was about to fall on his sword and kill himself, and Paul stopped him. And we talk about, beginning in verse 30, the conversion of the Philippian jailer. Most people are very familiar with that account. But I want to jump down to verse 35 through 37, and I want us to see exactly what took place, because here was Paul wrongfully beaten and thrown in prison by the government, who not only had their hand in a form of overreach, but a very abusive and unnecessary force that they used against Paul and Silas. And then basically tried to sweep it on the rug and cover it up, and tell everyone just go away and ignore what just happened. That's what we see happening. And that's what a lot of people are upset about today with everything happening in our country. They feel as though that is what's happening. Here's an instance in Scripture where the same thing has been taking place. And I want you to notice what Paul does. Go ahead and read that, Richard.
But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrate have sent me to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out."
This is something that struck me when looking at this particular text in the situation we find ourselves in, because here is Paul in essence fighting against the government and the abuse of power that they exhibited against him and Silas. They didn't say, all right, well, we're just gonna fine, we're gonna leave, we're gonna go our way, and we'll never come back here again, or however many people might want to, would probably do it today. But here's Paul saying, listen, you did this publicly. We were innocent. You beat us and you thrown in prison. You're going to answer for this. And he went through the proper means and channels to make sure that they were going to answer for this publicly. And I think in many ways that's something that people are asking for today. Let's make people answer for their actions, even if they're in government, even if they're police officers. Listen, if anyone is a supporter of the police, Blue Lives Matter, and I am a huge supporter of the police and law enforcement as a whole. Yes, there are some who abuse their power, who have done some terrible and mean things, and perhaps this is one of those instances. A couple of things that have happened in the past few weeks. But listen, notice what Paul did, and I think this is a great example of a Christian's response to this is not to sweep it on the rug and blame everyone else, or say, that with everything else, take away from what has happened, but rather stand up and say, no, no, no. They need to answer for what they did. Let them have their day in court and answer for their actions. Even if they are in law enforcement, if they've done something wrong, they'll have to answer for that. And that's exactly what Paul was doing. He was calling them out, telling them, you can't sweep this under the rug, dismiss us privately, especially when you did this publicly. You're going to answer for this publicly and give an account for what you've done.
Well, as you pointed out, Romans 13, government is referred to in the King James as ministers of God, and I believe in other versions it says servants of God, but they're ordained ministers of God for the very purpose of bringing justice to the wrongdoer. And we need them in order for us to be able to live a peaceful life, and just focusing on the persecution that's going to come upon us for
Yeah.
preaching the truth. Um, so we need to support law enforcement. Again, it's a minister of God. We should do everything we can to help law enforcement, but that does not mean there's not going to be abuses. In anything, there's going to be abuses. There's going to be abuses in any field of life, in any occupation. You're going to find some people who are just wrong in what they're doing, and with what the authority they've been given. Like you said, we in this country, um, and one of the good things about this country, a man is presumed to be innocent until proven guilty, and that's proven in a court of law. And we need to abide by that. We need to wait until everything has been laid forth. As far as this man goes, for instance, I think it's clear to say that any policeman that put his knee on someone's neck while he's begging for air, I can't be right when he's in handcuffs. What we don't know is his motivation. We don't know if it was racist or otherwise. Was he doing something wrong? Was he not being properly supervised? Was he not being properly trained? All these things we should be get receive answers to, because there's a loss of life, and if it happened to that man, Chris, it could happen to one of our kids. So it's important that we receive answers for this.
Yeah. And many people are screaming that at the heart of all of this is racism, which there's no evidence of to begin with, based upon past events, past things that have taken place. That in as a whole, racism is still in the mind of a lot of people, and there have been things that have taken place very recently in Minnesota. In fact, at the Mall of America, for example, where a black man took a white child and threw that child, over the edge, 4 stories high, and just and not much was said about that. Racism doesn't seem to be brought up in instances like that. But I think looters and those who are vandalizing the areas are trying to bring attention in the wrong way to a problem that still does exist in our country. You can't deny that. In fact, not only does it exist in our country, Richard, we would be naive and ignorant to say that it doesn't even still exist in local churches, not just in local churches, but denominationalism as a whole has a problem with racism. In the religious world, racism is something that still exists and still is a problem. And I'll give you in a couple of examples of it. The fact that there are black churches and white churches is a perfect example of the fact that racism still exists in this world, in religion. The fact that there are, like you've got the Methodists who have their own black Methodist church, and not just local congregation, just as a like a caucus or a group, basically. But then you've got local churches of Christ in various places that in certain areas and in cities that there will be black churches, and there was an instance where one had opportunity to join together, with two congregations that were fairly close to one another, but there were those who said, no, we have to have a black congregation here in the city. And it blew my mind that that still existed. Now, so it goes both ways, because I've know of churches that have asked preachers to come and hold meetings. They'll ask a black preacher to come and hold a meeting. The same week, another preacher's coming for a meeting, but they want the black preacher over at the other church so that the members of the black congregation won't attend their meeting. That's racism. That is appalling that that would take place. And I'm not talking 50, 60, 70 years ago. I'm talking 15 years ago. I'm talking 12 years ago that this kind of thing was taking place. And that's terrible. It's unbelievable that that would still take place, but to think that it doesn't, that's where I think we miss the point of a lot of what's taking place in the world today. Is some of this being blown way out of proportion? Is some of this being brought up because of other motives? Yes, I think there is some of that taking place, but that doesn't mean that racism isn't existent in our country and in the church, because it does. We need to remember Christ died for all, regardless of skin color, nationality, that the entire world is blessed through him.
Chris, racism is worldliness. It's one in Romans chapter 1. It's one of the things. It doesn't say racism. I mean, what is the word? Uh, we can say malice and various other things. It's listed there as the works of unrighteousness, or it's worldliness. And
Mm-hmm.
the answer to racism is Jesus Christ. But the world doesn't like Jesus Christ. So then the problem is there's always going to be a problem with racism in the world. We're not going to get rid of it. It's a worldly attribute. And that's hard for in our country. African Americans are a minority, and so they're going to constantly face it. It's going to be part of their life, and I'm sure they've already accepted that. But does that mean they're not going to feel frustrations? Oh, absolutely. Yes, they're going to feel tremendous frustrations. It's going to be very hard for them at times, and it's important that they have a haven that they can go to find relief, because it's a burden to carry, and that haven is supposed to be the church. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be problems with racism in the church. There are worldly things that creep up in the church all the time that the church has to deal with. But as long as the church is dealing with racism when it comes up, then the church can be that haven that in our country, an African American or whatever, if it's in the world, whatever, whoever is dealing with racism, they can go to church, and that can be and should be the place that they can go to be accepted as one of God's people and not have to worry about race. Chris, if, as a white man, I'm blind to it. I'll tell you right now, I am. I know I am. I have an African American friend that I used to play golf with. And, I used to get onto him because it just seemed like every little incident, he was bringing up racism. Oh, they're being racist. And I'd be like, no, they're not. You're overreacting. Well, one time, we were going to go play golf, and he drove an hour to get to where I was to where we could go play golf. And I had called ahead of time to make sure that we could tee off. And when we come in, the man behind the counter said, well, we can't tee off. There was nobody out there. There was nobody on the course, but he wasn't going to allow us to tee off. And I was like, why? And he said, well, we got a tournament starting in an hour. And I said, well, we'll just start on the back nine. And he denied that. And then he looked over at my African American brother, and it became very apparent to me, I could see it clearly, that this was an example of racism. Of course, I got upset at that point, but imagine if you have to face this type of situation 4 or 5 times a year. And every time you go someplace and you get out of your car and it's a mostly white environment, you're wondering if people are looking at you. You're wondering if people are judging you. You're wondering if people are going to accept you. You know, that could be that's a burden, and that's what our African American brothers have to carry. And so that's why it's very important. It's very important that we work to make church their haven, their place that they can go to and not have to worry about racism like they do in our government.
Hmm. Yeah, you're right. They shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to worry about it. Shouldn't have to be dealt with. But unfortunately, when you're bombarded with that daily, day in and day out, even coming to church, I'm sure, and I can speak from experience from another aspect, another angle of this. It is an issue that you can't just walk into a church building and think, okay, now I'm away from it. It's not a switch you turn on and off, especially when you're inundated every day. It would be great if that was the case. Now, very quickly, just so people understand my statement that as far as myself is concerned, I'm blind. And not only will I wear sunglasses, but I have a cane or I've had a guide dog. And, people staring, my kids would tell me people are staring at you. People would start taking pictures or videos as my guide dog would be working in the mall. And I was set out apart sometimes unknowingly, unless it was pointed out to me. But people, growing up, kids are mean. I mean, they try to trip you. They'll throw things at you and try to do things, because they think, oh, they can get away with it because you can't see, or they'll make fun of you because you can't see. So there were things in that aspect that when I walk in somewhere, there are looks, there's attention unwanted that can be gotten by those wherever I'm at. Thinking I can't do something, I won't be able to accomplish things, all because of my eyesight. And so, while there are a lot of differences, I understand there are some similarities that I've gone through in that respect, and and it's unfortunate. It really is. And but what gets me, and on the news, there were two things on the news that really got to me over the past 2 days. Yesterday, here in Springfield, a protester who said, "Oh, white folks came and were joining next to us," and I told them, "Why are they here? This has got nothing to do with them. They want to support us. Well and good, but you know, you know, this is not about you. So leave." Yeah, what was the point of what's the point of you being out there? Especially when you have folks coming out saying, "We want to support you. We're with you. We want the change to take place," and then they treat them that way. And granted, that's one, not the whole, but nevertheless, that was what was on the media. And then this morning on the Today Show, they had a rapper came on who was pleading with Atlanta and other places not to burn down their cities. And at first it sounded like this was a great, thing for this guy to do, and the message to get out. But there's one thing that stuck out to me, and I think in a way it gets to another part of this issue, and that is when he pointed out, don't let your anger for our enemy bring you to burn down your own city. And let me tell you something. When you have an attitude, regardless of race or nationality, that the government or the police are your enemy, and that's a as a whole, that's not, with exceptions, that it's they're for us with a few exceptions that we've got to deal with. No, the enemy as a whole, that right there is racism. That right there is wrong. And it's hard to come together in unity, even in Christ, when that type of message is what's being promoted, saying that basically everyone else is our enemy. Yes, they need to stop the looting. We need to make sure that our communities are protected and taken care of, and we can stand together in this, even as Christians, taking responsibility and having the government held to accountability. But it needs to be done in peace. And we need to understand the government is not our enemy. The Lord has set it in place for a purpose. And we can do what we can to make sure it fulfills its purpose with mercy and justice and rightly. And I think that's where Christians should stand on this. Richard, I'll give you the last word and then we'll wrap up.
Racism is worldly, and we live in the world.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for my African American brothers, and they already know this, it's not going away. But as fellow citizens in the kingdom and joint heirs with them, with Jesus Christ, we can, as preachers, preach against racism, and we can do that in the church to try to promote love as we should. And we can help the church be that haven and help them with their burden, because that is a burden that they have to carry. And like I said, it's going to be frustrating. And it would be nice if they had brethren that they could cry on their shoulder from time to time. And, that can happen at church. But we need to make sure that we preach racism is worldly. Even though it's in the world, let's keep it out of the church.
Yeah. Yep. Amen to that. All right, folks. Well, appreciate you guys tuning in today when it comes to the Sowers with Swords program every Tuesday at 10 o'clock Central Time on YouTube and on Facebook. Be sure and visit our website, southsidesower.com, for the Southside Church of Christ here in Springfield, Missouri. And if you have comments, you've got questions, be sure and leave them below here on our Facebook at facebook.com/SouthsideSower. And of course, our YouTube channel for the Southside Church of Christ as well. And we'll be happy to answer those questions that you may have. Check out thecarneychurch.com, where Richard is preaching in Kearney, Missouri, up northeast of Kansas City. And you can follow him in the preaching and endeavors that he has on Facebook and other social media as well. But until next time, remember, regardless of your situation, Galatians chapter 3:29, no longer Jew or Gentile, male or female, those who are Christ are Abraham's seed, and our desire is for everyone to be Christ's. Thank you for watching Sowers with Swords.
Thank you for watching Sowers with Swords, a work of Southside Church of Christ which meets at 1517 East Cherokee Street in Springfield, Missouri. Visit our website for more information, southsidesower.com, or email us at southsidesower@gmail.com.